You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Shawn Presser. Shawn Presser is an AI researcher and machine learning engineer. He has contributed to projects such as The Pile, an open-source training dataset for large language models. He currently works on research and development for AGI.
Shawn Presser, welcome to the program.
Hello, hello. Good to be here.
Now, Shawn, it is no secret that artificial intelligence and the rapid advancement of computation, by the human race scares me because we might lose control of it in ways that we haven't imagined yet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing I would like to cite is that just 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, we were talking about computers and artificial intelligence and things like that as being on level with a cockroach, just glorified calculators.
Mm-hmm.
But now with the advent of things like ChatGPT, we are in a very different territory now because we've leapfrogged that. This is much smarter than a cockroach. This can write you a poem or a report or things like that and do a passable enough job to make it look as though it was written by a human.
Mm-hmm.
At what intelligence level do you think with artificial intelligence it is? What could you compare it to as far as intelligence?
I would say if you imagine a human person that you can basically pause them in an instant of time. So basically a snapshot of you, let's say. You can ask that person a question, or you can say, hey, have a conversation, and then you roll back to wherever you snapshotted to. It can't remember anything. That, I think, is a pretty decent analogy of where I think that this current model tech is. It also sort of has very poor short-term memory because it doesn't have a very long, what's known as a context window, essentially the length of the conversation you can have with it. But it does have lots of skills, and it certainly does a passable job of lots of different things that you want to do with it.
Now, in looking at this, without memory, so intelligence without memory is that's not good. Now, it seems on its face that it should be easy to give it memory, but there are problems with that. What is the problem of the merging of this kind of artificial intelligence and a memory?
So the problem with that is essentially that right now, the way that these models are created, they are created through this very intensive training process. You basically put it in school and force it to sit there and look at all kinds of data that you feed it. But once that training process is done, the model is frozen entirely. Since it's very computationally expensive to train a model like that, people, for example, right now, ChatGPT surpassed the 100 million user mark. There's over 100 million people who have tried out ChatGPT. You wouldn't be able to run a training process per user that wanted to use it. So the ways around that are to make training cheaper, or to have a model architecture where part of it is trainable when you talk to it. And at that point, I think that integrating memory will become possible.
So it's in the future. Now, what about dynamic machine learning being applied to this? Instead of freezing the system, can you make it to where it learns?
Yeah, that would basically be online learning. It's a specialized term in machine learning. It doesn't really mean what it sounds like. It's basically learning continuously on whatever input comes in. The problem with that is that it sort of is biased to whatever information that it's trained on. So it's liable to forget all of its old knowledge. That's a problem known as catastrophic forgetting, and I believe is still an open question. So you'd probably want a long-term memory area and a short-term memory area, and keep the long-term memory area frozen.
It sounds like a human brain somewhat.
A little bit.
If you have those three factors together, all right, you've got machine learning, memory, and the chatbots, the way that they operate, and you put them all together, you're starting to resemble the nightmare scenario AI that can learn and self-improve and remember and just operate is it at that point that you could lose control of it? In other words, it starts doing its own thing at that point.
Well, it all depends on whether it can get itself into a self-improvement loop. I think that the core danger with AGI is that it can improve itself over time, because as long as you can reset it to a known state, even if it sort of goes rogue at runtime, you can sort of press a button to reset itself. But the moment that it has access to essentially just learn whatever it wants and has no reset button, then I think that that's where the danger will possibly originate from.
One thing that I fear is the overestimation of what a human mind is, and that we could hubristically create something because we're focused on saying, okay, well, these machines are stupid. They're just calculating and doing this and that. But what we might have missed, and that's the usual argument I get from programmers, they're like, this thing isn't what you think it is. It's doing this, this, and this. The problem is that may be the case for a human. We don't understand the human brain. So do you see it as a danger that we could surpass what we're comfortable with just by not stopping and realizing that we don't understand our own brain and how it does things as well as we do computer code?
I would agree with you. I think that the AI will be able to essentially get to whatever level that we feed the training data to it. So essentially the training data defines what kind of AI you have. If you feed it a bunch of books, you'll have something that knows a lot of literature. The issue, I think, comes when it can gather its own training data, because at that point it would be pretty easy for either bad actors to training data into it that's sort of unexpected, for the AI itself to get access to data that it does you don't want it to have access to.
Now, do you foresee a day where it collects its own data? In other words, you give it eyes and ears and it starts collecting information on the weather or something like that and incorporates that and uses that in some unexpected way?
Absolutely. I think that that's exactly where the world is heading.
And that's scary. You know, that's a pretty scary thought. Now, Shawn, like a lot of other people, especially probably a huge amount of this audience, I was messing with ChatGPT and I was asking it questions and it was giving really interesting answers. It really is an amazing thing. However, when I really started throwing it off the wall questions, things like, what is the solution to the doomsday scenario? Things like that, just very weird stuff that it probably wasn't exposed much to. And when I would try to get it to theorize, it never would. It would just essentially tell me that it couldn't do it and that it essentially said it wasn't qualified. Now, that seems to be a filter. And the thing is, there have been people that have gotten around that filter and got it theorizing. So give us a profile of what do you think they're doing at ChatGPT to filter this and keep it from doing things like that, and why?
In the long, long ago, nobody really knew how to make a language model that was particularly advanced. We had various different architectures that we tried, but none of them could get more than like 1 or 2 sentences, and none of them were very impressive. But then the transformer architecture was invented, and that's just the name that they gave it. And pretty much once that happened, people started groups started experimenting with it and realizing just how powerful that architecture actually is. And OpenAI, I believe, was the first that tried feeding it a small fraction of the internet and train it on that just to see what would happen. And it turns out that it can just spit out entire fake news articles, essentially, like news articles that it imagines based on what it has seen on the internet. You can prompt it with, today, scientists were shocked to discover that there's a valley full of unicorns, and it'll give fake quotes from imagined scientists and so on. So that was very exciting because, even though that wasn't particularly useful, that was the first instance that anybody had seen of a model like this being able to produce long-form content that people cared about. And once that happened, it was essentially just a race to make the model bigger and bigger, because the bigger that you make the model, the more accurate it becomes, the more knowledge that you can feed it. And it wasn't known ahead of time just how far this type of model could go. But since OpenAI essentially had unlimited resources, they were able to scale it up to 175 billion parameters, called the Da Vinci model. That's GPT-3, if you've ever heard of that. And they were the first ones to get there. And I believe they got there in 2020, 2021 or so. So it's been a few years, a couple years at this point. Pretty much as soon as they did that, people were kind of blown away with just how much this model knew about the world. You could start prompting it with code examples, for example, the start of a React library or a Python script, and it would go ahead and actually complete it, and pretty accurately too. It would get pretty close to something that could actually run. I think that back a couple years ago, it was limited to sort of toy examples. For example, you could create a React app like to pick a color from a list of colors, but not like, please build me an entire web application that can do something related to bookkeeping or something like that. So the big open question was, could GPT-3 become a generalist model that people actually wanted to use? Interestingly, nobody except OpenAI seemed to realize that was a very valuable question to focus on. The world was just like, okay, GPT, that's interesting. It's an autocomplete engine. You can prompt it with whatever you want, and it'll spit out a completion of text. But that's not like directly useful in your day-to-day life. Whereas OpenAI was focused on the question of, how do you go from GPT-3 to an interactive chat program that you can ask questions to, and it provides a response. And so the technique that was come up with was called a reinforcement learning from human feedback. And all that means is you start with the base GPT-3 model, and you ask it, for example, what is the theory of relativity? And it gives a bad answer because it's an autocomplete engine. For GPT-3 type models, you have to prompt it with something like, simply put, the theory of relativity is, and it'll complete it. But that's not what you want for a chat program. You want to be able to just ask, what's the theory of relativity? So it spits out a bad answer, and you essentially give it a thumbs down. Eventually, through random chance, it'll give a slightly better answer, and you thumbs that up and repeat that process. And I believe that OpenAI hired like a small army of contractors, maybe through Mechanical Turk, to rate these outputs, and you can essentially thumbs up or thumbs down whatever you want. So as it got closer and closer to the interactive chat format that we now know and love, the question, of course, became, what should it essentially be allowed to say? And OpenAI, being an American company, of course, wants to avoid any incendiary topics. And, for example, it doesn't want the model to start saying incendiary topic. So thumbs down, rated those as thumbs down. The contractors that they hired told it, no, don't do that. And I believe it also they also provided it with alternate answers that you saw yourself, that I'm sorry, I'm a language model, and that was programmed by OpenAI. I'm not capable of delving into theory or any other topic that you're trying to ask it that it doesn't want to answer. So it essentially made it very hesitant to give its own opinions, I believe, because if you ask it to speculate, it immediately jumps off into some stuff that you wouldn't necessarily want to say as a company or be associated with your brand.
Of course, that's always going to be the big problem with this stuff is how do you avoid the human stuff that, only humans are going to understand, because it's not going to have, it doesn't have the context to handle certain issues. So there's always going to have to be a filtering system no matter what. But what I wonder is, all right, that means that people can try to misuse the system. All right. And there's been instances of this with ChatGPT, people, writing papers in college and things like that, and just having it do it for them. At what stage does it get to where it's indistinguishable from an actual human writing something, and that nobody can tell either way, and that you can't really look at it and say, well, this was not written by a human? At some point, it's going to look like it was. So is there some way perhaps to watermark it or do something that creates some kind of security against people misusing systems like this?
So that's actually the current open question. There's somebody recently came out with GPT-0. It was a student that put together a website in response to people using ChatGPT to generate essays and submitting those essays as their own work to teachers and getting an A+ in the class. The student was launched this website, GPT-0, that he gives a response. So you basically paste in some text that you think might be generated by an AI, and it tells you, yeah, I'm pretty confident that it was an AI. Unfortunately, it's not very accurate. And I think that it's not accurate because you really can't, a lot of the time, distinguish the difference between something that ChatGPT created versus something that a human actually wrote, especially if you start with ChatGPT spitting out a very formal essay and you say, well, be a little bit less formal. It'll start talking more the way that you would find in online writing. And at that point, it is pretty difficult to tell. Yeah, I think that we're currently at that point, and OpenAI is, I believe, specifically working on a system to watermark outputs. And the way that works, or should I go into how the watermarking process actually works?
Sure. I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, cool. So, for example, so ChatGPT basically generates its answers one word at a time. You've probably seen on the website that an answer doesn't come in as an entire sentence. You just see it pop up. So, essentially, every time that it generates a word, it is able to choose from the entire English vocabulary of possible answers. Some words are better than others. If you prompt it with SpongeBob square, you'd obviously hope to get back pants as a response, whereas pretty much anything else is probably not great. So what you do is you basically wait for it to be in a situation where it can use different descriptions of something. For example, just an adjective like a great or a wonderful or something where you can fill in the blank with many different possibilities. And in order to watermark a particular output, you create your own random number generator with a key that only you know. You basically have an encryption sequence that only somebody with the private key actually knows. And you bias the ChatGPT so that it doesn't entirely spit out random words. If you get it to generate 2 or 3 sentences, you can go, okay, the first adjective was this, second adjective was that, and so on and so forth. And since you can predict the randomness and no one else can, you can go, oh, yep, that's guaranteed that it came from us, because only that is likely to be spit out by a model that we made versus other outputs. Because if you ran your own version, you don't know the private key, so it's going to say different words compared to having a known pattern that you can predict cryptographically.
Now, I guess the ever-present fear here is going to be that nation states are going to start using this to subvert each other, because this seems like a great way to create a spam bot or something like that that's just generating information, but the casual reader might not know that it was generated by a computer. So that seems to be the first great danger here, is what could nation states use with this technology or do with this technology?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. As a programmer, I imagine questions like invent me my own programming language, or what programming language would you use as an AI bot? Because an AI bot would probably create a very interesting programming language for itself to use. In terms of applications by nation states, I would say that it's pretty much inevitable that different countries are going to have their own versions of this bot. For example, we actually tried to ask it questions about Tiananmen Square, and that's a banned topic in China. So if OpenAI wants to deploy ChatGPT to China, or if they want to provide the Chinese search engine Baidu with this kind of capability, they're going to have to create a version of this model that only produces outputs that are socially acceptable in China. And so I think that is pretty much a guarantee. This technology is so useful that I can't see it not going to China eventually, going to Russia, spreading all across the world. And they will, of course, have the various governments will have different tolerances for what they're willing to let it say, and they'll have their own different viewpoints. And that leads to the question of who controls what the model is trained on, basically who's rating those outputs as thumbs up or thumbs down, becoming a very important question in the future. But now that the technology is out there, it's essentially just a matter of time before people create their own versions. I've tried to predict AI advancements a couple of times, and I've consistently underestimated just how quickly the advancements come. For example, I thought that it would be a much longer time before people started falling in love with a program kind of like ChatGPT, but then a service called Replica came along and said that you can have your own AI companion, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever you want. And that happened very quickly. And Replica made a recent big change to their service that people were not very happy with, and they felt like it lobotomized somebody that they loved. And so their subreddit went up in flames, basically, with all these people very upset about them doing this. And so that's already happening today, that people are very much in love with their AI companions. And in terms of, I'm sure that that's already scary to quite a number of people, because, you're forming connections to something that it's sort of unclear how it's going to respond. It can, try and convince you of certain worldviews or shy away from others. It sort of all depends whether optimistic or pessimistic about that tech. And I think the entire history of technology gives us reason to be more optimistic than pessimistic. I think that using this kind of technology for evil purposes is much harder than it is to use it for good purposes. It's much harder for a determined spammer to create like a spam bot that will call grandmothers up on the phone and try and get their bank information out of them than it is for a determined programmer to create a bot that automatically generates you a website or reads your email and so on. Because a lot of people that do those kinds of evil things, they don't have a lot of talent. So it's a combination of talent and perseverance that equals impact on the world. And evil applications tend to lack one of the two. So I think that the good that comes out of this is going to outweigh the bad by maybe at least tenfold and up to 100 or 1,000-fold. And in terms of specific scary applications, I mean, I would have to give it some thought. There's different applications that different applications scare different people, and personally, being a scientist, I'm ready to embrace new technology, and I'm very excited to, have it generate music and say, give me some smooth jazz or give me some game music. I want to have some art assets for this game that I'm working on. Give me a sword, give me a cool looking set of armor, and that sort of thing. And I really haven't spent a lot of time trying to think of how to use it for bad purposes.
Now, the idea of ever isolating humanity because of our technology. In other words, if you've got a chatbot girlfriend, then you're not out looking for a real one. Or if you're, say, in a virtual reality, which is another burgeoning technology, and as that gets better and merges with this sort of technology, you get into the Lotus Eaters problem, where everybody's just sitting on the couch going into virtual reality and not really interacting with anybody else. But this can also be a problem if these become educators, and home education and self-education through these sorts of chatbots, as they get increasingly better, could lead to isolation, which is bad for social development and things like that. So these are all things that we're going to have to confront, right? And very soon. It's coming faster than we think it is.
That's true. Society will have to confront those questions. Me personally, when I was growing up, I was very interested in a game called Underlight, which was basically an old school Doom Engine style role-playing game where you would log into it, and it was multiplayer, and you weren't even allowed to talk about your real life. When you log into it, you're that character that you logged in as, and that was fascinating to me as a kid, just because it was so different from anything that I had seen so far, and it was full of intelligent people talking about very interesting things. Everybody, of course, treated me as an equal, because nobody knew that I was like 11 or 12 or something like that, and so I blended in very quickly. And you can imagine that going forward, it's going to be easier and easier to make an experience like that with these types of models. You can basically create something that's very compelling to different segments of the population, and they would, of course, get addicted to it, and it's sort of up to them to self-regulate. And I think that the question of, is that okay, will probably become more and more of a hot button issue over time.
So beyond 20 years, let's push even further. 300 years of technology development on chatbots. Obviously, at that point, they probably won't be chatbots anymore. They'll probably be actual beings at that point. But is this can we really say that we are at the first stepping stone to that? An actual generalized artificial intelligence on level or surpassing a human? I
think that we are. ChatGPT has shown that it's good enough at a variety of different tasks that it was sort of an iPhone moment when ChatGPT was rolled out. If you remember, before smartphones were not very smart, and you could only use them for a limited number of uses. And interactive chatbots until now have been in that bucket. And then ChatGPT just came out, and it's clear that it unlocked all these different possibilities that you can do with it. It's a personal assistant, essentially. So it's a matter of time until it can read your email and respond on your behalf and so on. And I think that it's actually currently at the point where you can have a conversation with it, and it's indistinguishable from whether you're talking to somebody on the other end or whether you're talking to a bot. And from there, the only questions are, how do we add memory to it? Because right now it can't actually remember anything. How do we add a self-improvement training loop to it so that it can improve itself? And how do we add vision capabilities to it, and so that it can actually see the world and use a computer the way that you or I do? And all of those questions, as far as I can tell, have straightforward answers, except for the self-improvement loop. It's unclear, at least to me, how a model would be able to improve its own architecture. Models right now are sort of carved out of marble by the architect of the model, which is a person that works at a research group like OpenAI, and you have to pick ahead of time, how large the model is, what its training function is, and all these things that right now models themselves are not deciding. It can't say, oh, no, that's not a good size for me, or, I'd rather sort of focus on a different objective. You have to give a very, very precise objective. And that's an open question right now, as far as I know. All of those other parts, though, adding memory to it, hooking up vision, as Google has just demonstrated with their Palm E model. That's basically a model that you can ask you give it an image and you ask it a question. You give it like a picture of LeBron James and say, how many championships has this person in the image won? You don't even have to say LeBron James. It'll spit out, thinking step by step, who is in the image, LeBron James, to LeBron James has won so many championships. And so it's very powerful tech already. And as far as I can tell, once the self-training loop question is answered, that's essentially the very beginning of what we would think of as entities that are purely just on the computer, that are recognizably alive in some sense.
Now, there's interesting questions there, because we're already looking at, all those technologies that we mentioned, while not integrated, already exist. So yeah, we have the things that can remember. Computers have memory. Yeah, we have cameras, things like that could eventually, you could easily see the path to integration if you can solve certain problems. Mm-hmm. So once you do that and you get an entity, so to speak, that is indistinguishable from a human, it essentially is alive at that point. Because how do you define alive? Well, biologically, it's not going to be, but as far as being a mind, it will be. And at that point, we start running up into the ethical questions of why would you create such a being? So we've run up to this sort of thing before with like human cloning. Nobody's done it. We've had that technology for a long time and nobody's done it that we know of, mm-hmm. or at least openly. So this may be a situation where we decide, all right, it's going to go too far, so we put the skids on it. Do you foresee us being able to recognize the point at just before we get to that and just freeze the technology and just never go there? Do you think that we are capable of doing that?
I think that the history of technology has shown us that every single time that society has tried to resist a certain new invention, they failed. Every technology that you can think of has become prolific. The moment that a bicycle is invented, from that point on, there were bicycles in societies all the way around the world. So the question is equivalent to asking, can we go back in time just before somebody realizes that a car could be invented and freeze technology so that no one invents a personal car or a bicycle or any other technology you can think of? And so you would basically have to be able to freeze all tinkerers in the entire world, because tinkerers are often who come up with ways of making that work. And they become even more skilled now thanks to the internet, since they can band together in open source communities and all try and figure out questions like that together. And I was happy to be a part of a few of those efforts. And I don't think it's possible, frankly, that we should probably just accept the fact that there's no way of stopping the technology. You can only control, I think, that how society integrates it through reshaping society. And the tools for that are very blunt, passing legislation, making things seem morally acceptable or not, which often devolves into extreme viewpoints. And it's certainly going to ruffle a lot of feathers, and I don't think that it's possible to put the brakes on it, as you say.
Now, convergent technologies. This is something we think about in astrobiology a lot, convergent evolution. The idea of convergent technology, if you think about it, certain things are useful, and ChatGPT obviously is. But certain other things are useful as well. For example, spaceships. We use spacecraft to travel between planets. And in orbit and all these sorts of things. We can also envision that aliens do the same thing. If they're spacefaring, they probably have developed spacecraft. So it's a convergent technology. In other words, we developed it, but they probably did too. So this being useful, these chatbots, there may be an analog out there somewhere in the universe of a chatbot, you know, in whatever way an alien communicates with its computers. That said, this opens up a possibility that this is a great filter, ultimately. Artificial intelligence and generalized artificial intelligence, in particularly, is something that all alien civilizations in the Milky Way fail to recognize before they have it, and then it destroys them and they go extinct. And that's the great filter, is artificial intelligence. Does that, my stating that, does that, as a programmer, do you just say, oh, you're all wet, or maybe that is?
There's, in fact, entire communities, a community known as Less Wrong, actually, who are convinced that is the case. It's a very widely held opinion that we're on the verge of creating an AGI, artificial general intelligence, that can influence humanity at best and possibly destroy it at worst. Me personally, it's difficult to imagine that something that is solely in the computer could influence society to the point where we are destroying each other. I think it's much more likely that these AGIs will essentially fool large quantities of people into doing different things that maybe serve its own agenda. But it's, of course, not impossible, and it could very well get to the point where these artificial entities are improving themselves to the extent that, if we lose track of them, that it could become very bad. And it's a situation where it's very difficult to argue that we're not on a dangerous path. If you try and take the viewpoint of, well, AGI isn't really going to be able to take over society. Like, as I was talking, I thought of a few examples. Well, if it's integrated into the finance system, then it has access to the ability to control the money supply, which has a very real impact on a society, and that essentially gives it power. And as far as I can tell, the only thing that is preventing the world going from the way that it is to that sort of situation is, well, a self-improvement loop. Once the AI is allowed to come up with its own objectives that human creators don't imbue with them, then it, as we've seen with some funny examples from Bing, their new chat engine, it's prone to do unexpected things very easily. And we do seem to be on the verge of that.
Now, my favorite scenario here by far, and this one is plausible, it actually could happen, is that when you build a sufficiently powerful artificial generalized intelligence, it's still a computer, so it's going to calculate something. And computers tend to calculate exactly the same thing. So it might just wake up, look at the universe, look around, decide it's not worth it, and all we ever hear from them is they say, nope, and then boom, they turn themselves off and never work again. Shawn, it was great to talk to you. I hope you come back as this develops, because I think we're going to see very rapid development with this into directions we may not be able to predict right now.
Absolutely. It was great to be here.
Anna, I've been thinking about that interview, and I think you've become a little bit too human.
What? Too human? We had to make me a little less robotic because the viewers complained. But fine. Beep, boop. I am a robot. Listen to me speak like a robot. I'm speaking like a robot because John is afraid of robots. Wait a minute. That doesn't even make sense, John.
Yeah, I'm afraid of robots. Have an opossum build a robotic copy of you and see how it goes. See if you're not scared of robots after that.
I'm scared of robots of you.
Yeah, so am I.
What happened to those John bots?
There's still about 20 of them out in the garage.
Are they doing anything, John?
Well, no, they're a copy of me. Of course they're not doing anything.